Welcome to the third video of our local parish mission. In our last video, we concluded with Fathers Rodrigues and Garp separating after the martyrdom of the 3 Japanese Christians in the local village. But just prior to that, an important moment happened in the life of Kichijiro, who was the guide of these 2 priests coming in from Asia all the way into Japan. While Father Rodrigues was preaching and providing the sacraments for the village of Goto, he also heard the confession of Kichijiro. Now, in the last video, I mentioned that Kichijiro apostatized when 3 of the martyrs did not. But it wasn't his first time. Turns out that in the village of Goto, Rodrigues discovered that Kichijiro had in fact apostatized. And when they met him originally, he had escaped, or not escaped, but left Japan in shame. His family had been brutally martyred. And he, having given up his faith, watched his family die. And so the result was he collapsed in sorrow and in alcohol. His tragedy then continued throughout his exile. But he mentions that the encounter with the priests gave him this feeling that God might take him back. And so in Goto, Father Rodrigues hears his confession. And of course, after Kichijiro is offered up, if you will, by the villagers, he apostatizes again and runs off into the wilderness. It's a torment that he will then continue to experience and suffer throughout the rest of the book. And his story is one that must not be forgotten, because in a certain way, he's almost the protagonist of the entire story. There's another hidden character that is mentioned at the beginning of the book, but will get a more thorough treatment today. And he is Inoue, the governor of Chikugo. He's mentioned at the very beginning of the book as the great terror and persecutor of the Christian church. He himself actually had been baptized, received the faith, but then at a certain moment in his life renounced it. And because of, in a sense, his insider knowledge of Christianity, was a much more effective persecutor of the Christians. He devised many torments and tortures that would defeat many priests and the faithful. And he had yet to receive a formal introduction throughout the story, but remained a kind of evil genius in the background. He's also known as the Inquisitor, which is not without a certain amount of irony. As, of course, those who grew up in the Western world, we typically associate inquisitors with Christianity and specifically with the Roman Catholic Church. But the temptation to be an inquisitor happens anywhere where one wants to look at ideas as foreign bodies or dangers that can cause a sickness or disease in the larger body. So an inquisitor almost acts like white blood cells, attacking a disease inside a body. Now, the danger with an inquisitor is the same with an immune system that has gone awry. And so it's not without the irony then that the persecutor of the Christians in Japan has the same attitude and mentality of many persecutors within the Christian world. It's almost as if the inquisitorial temptation is both corrupting the church from within in Europe, but also attacking the church from without in Japan. Now, the character of Inoue, as well as some of the other characters in the book, are actually based on historical figures. One of the reasons why this book is so good is that it does not have simple caricatures. It doesn't simply say, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. It reflects the real dimension and quality of human beings who are paradoxical, strange, conflicted. And that even in Christianity, our God is so good that he actually is our antagonist from time to time, bringing out, in a sense, what truly lies within us. Because, and we'll be frank here, sometimes God, being our antagonist, is trying to bring the best out in us. But it takes work, and it takes time. But what happens when we just don't know? Can't quite say yet. But after Father Rodrigues and Father Sgarpe split up, Rodrigues goes for quite a long time in his own wandering in the wilderness, and after leaving Tumogi, he finds his way back to Goto, that village that he had preached separately away from Father Garpe. He realizes that it's a wasteland and there's nothing left. The town had been scattered. And he wanders in the wilderness and eventually finds one person he follows after. He finds a smoldering campfire, and longing for some kind of companionship also just seems to seek this person out. Turns out that person is Kichijiro. And that does not make Father Rodrigues all that happy. Even though Father Rodrigues had told the three martyrs and Kichijiro to trample on the Fumi, when he finally sees Kichijiro, it's with a kind of scorn and contempt and can barely stand his presence, even though Kichijiro tries to take care of him, give him food, give him water. He tries to push him away. He scorns the gift of food that Kichijiro brings him, even though he in the end still eats it. But the tragedy is very soon after, Kichijiro turns Rodrigues into the authorities. They throw silver at his feet, and Kichijiro pleads for Father Rodrigues to forgive him again. Rodrigues is taken away, and a whole new phase in the book begins. But before I go any further, I would like to read a passage from the Acts of the Apostles. And he, Paul, came also to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman, who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brethren at Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him, because of the Jews that were in those places, for they all knew his father was a Greek. As they went on their way through the cities, they delivered to them the observance, the decision for which they had reached by the apostles and elders who were at Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith, and they increased in numbers daily. And they went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. And when they had come opposite to Mysia, they attempted to go to Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing, beseeching him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." That reading is interesting for me for many reasons. First, Timothy, as the price for evangelizing among the Jewish communities, has himself circumcised as an adult so as to be acceptable to them. That's what we call enculturation, maybe. But it shows you an understanding even among the early Christians as to what's required. Timothy knows, and Paul knows, that circumcision is not spiritually necessary. That was the decree of the Council of Jerusalem that was referred to in the reading. But in order to make a human connection, has himself circumcised. Whew! God bless him. But that's what we call counting the cost. But you'll notice then, as the story then develops, the Spirit of God does not allow them to go into Asia and some other regions. Now, that seems, again, pretty strange, but the Spirit of God says, you can't go there. Go over here instead. So they're sent to Macedonia. But this then underlines some questions. Sometimes the Spirit of God might say, don't go there. Not yet. Now, with those two dimensions of Timothy and his sacrifice that he's willing to make, and the injunction against going into Asia, my reasonable hypothesis is that sometimes God says, there are some sacrifices you are not prepared yet to make. You haven't grown yet. You haven't endured enough to be able to know what is required of you in this moment. Because that's a lot to get yourself circumcised. But sometimes there's even more. Because the very transition out of circumcision in the Christian tradition reveals that sometimes the most painful sacrifices don't hurt the body, but the soul. I remember writing a paper many years ago, back when I was in the seminary. I made a joking comment in a paper, but I meant it. That circumcision has always been a sacramental of faith. It's something that is profoundly important to you and is a marker of your identity, but it's not necessarily something you want to show around all that much. It hurts, it's dangerous, but you don't show it, but it's witnessed by the overall effects in life. So a circumcision as a sacramental of faith and one's willingness to undergo it shows a resolute resolve. What Fr Rodrigues will go through in the rest of today's discussions or reflections is the circumcision of spirit that is incredibly difficult to undergo. Now the question is, does he succeed? After Fr Rodrigues is apprehended, he's guided for some time through the woods to the major city. And in that escort, he is also then brought into close contact with some other Christians who had been arrested. Two in particular are by the names of Monica and Juan, and they proudly hold their Christian names before Fr Rodrigues. Monica even has this generosity of spirit and hands him a small piece of cucumber that she had been hiding for some time. Fr Rodrigues graciously and thankfully receives the cucumber and starts nibbling on it because he'd been eating nothing but dried fish for some time. So you can only imagine how fresh cucumber would taste to him. Now, when he experiences that generosity, he also notices a kind of staidness in the face. They're calm. And their calm in what appears to be impending death causes him no shortage of frustration. In his own thoughts, he calls them ignorant. And then says, "Do you not realize that we're about to die?" Immediately realizing how shameful that is, he apologizes and eats the food. And then comes the old man that they had encountered back in Tsumogi. The old man who kind of stood in the background when they had discerned that Mokichi and Ichizo and the others had reservations when they were making the fumi, He comes in with this quiet smile, sits down and says, "Oh, I'm an old man, I can't get anything, and this is so hot out here. Please understand where I'm coming from. But it's okay. Give yourself some time to think over it, and to think over from our point of view that we don't hate you. We're not angry at you. We just want you to be reasonable and understand why this Christian thing has to stop. Now go." Now, what's interesting is that the moment that he dismisses the Christians, Father Rodrigues goes up with them, but in a flash of anger, the old man goes, "No, you, stay." Father Rodrigues then is asked if his Japanese is sufficient for a conversation. And the old man declares his contempt of the peasants. His face changes, so you can tell that this old man, even though he does not respect the peasants very much, knows that it doesn't serve very well to antagonize them. But he points out something of tremendous importance to the priest. There we go. The old man tells Father Rodrigues he wants him to apostatize. This strikes Father Rodrigues as rather presumptuous. Who does he think I am, really? And Father Rodrigues thinks that he's simply going to be tortured. Now, the old man says, no, we won't do that. If we did that, the peasants would become even more stubborn. We made that mistake in Omura and Nagasaki. The Christians are a stubborn crowd. In the very beginning of the Christian persecutions, the Japanese authorities discovered that any time you tortured the Christians and killed them, that only strengthened their resolve and their purpose. Which is why when Mokichi and Ishizo were martyred, their bodies were burned so as to prevent the veneration of their bodies. And so they wanted to find a slightly different warfare. But what the old man also points out, it's an important line that he says to Father Rodrigues when Father Rodrigues insists that he suffer instead. The priest says, "Shouldn't you have pity for these people who are going to suffer and suffer for you? It is because of you that they must suffer," concluded the old man. In the movie that Martin Scorsese directed, the adaptation of this book, which is quite good, definitely worth watching, I just don't know how to edit, he says, "The price for your glory is their suffering." I don't know which one I like better, but I think I like the movie version just a little bit better. The price for your glory is their suffering. Unless you apostatize, they will suffer. Now the old man walks away, and Father Rodrigues is put in a tiny little cell. And inside the cell, it's dark and hard to see. And soon the door opens, and the priest is greeted in Portuguese. It's broken Portuguese with a slight accent, but it's clear and its meaning is understandable. It's like a gracia, padre. It's like a greetings, father. Can't speak Portuguese, don't know the accent. And eventually it turns out that he's been given a translator who had studied in one of the Portuguese seminaries before the persecution. This man had learned Portuguese and has now been commissioned by the governors to act as an inquisitor, act as a translator, so that the testimony of Father Rodrigues could be clear and well understood. But before they really get down to business, the two of them get into a theological argument. I won't go into too many of those details. You can read them for yourself. But what's interesting is Father Rodrigues is almost relieved that he can debate theology with the locals. And the translator engages in the conversation and is dismissive of how dismissive the priest is of his Buddhist traditions. The priest says, every man dies, only the true God, yada, 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 yada. And the translator goes, you're ignorant. You don't understand what you're talking about. But what's of particular importance in the latter parts of this interrogation or conversation is the translator points out that the inquisitor, this Inoue character, had several priests tortured, and that he might be next. And he rattles off some names. And he also gives the name of Father Ferreira. Now, Father Rodrigues then perks up a little bit, but tries to hide it in his heart that he knows who this man would be. He says, do you know him? And Father Rodrigues then plays his cards and doesn't play his cards and says, maybe he's from a different congregation, I don't know him. The translator says to him, well, he's a Japanese man now, with a Japanese wife, and is apostatized. Father Rodrigues says, I don't believe you. At which point he'll say, you'll see for yourself. When the translator walks out, he says a little line almost muttered beneath his breath. And he says this, a selfish rascal if there ever was one. But anyhow, he'll end up by apostatizing. Now again, in the movie, something else is brought out, and he says about Ferreira, he's held in high esteem now, which is why I believe he came here in the first place. And as he walks out of the cell, he says, an arrogant man, which means that he will fall eventually. It seems that Father Rodrigues has not quite kept in mind who he's dealing with. The old man seems to be a little bit more cunning than he lets on, and the translator seems to have him figured out, even if he might not have absolutely won the debate. They pick up on something that we as Christians can sometimes neglect, which is oftentimes that you can have all the right answers, but yet fail in your mission because of some flaw in our character, or some flaw in our identity. And it can be that makes us lose just as much as anything. You can imagine then Timothy wanting to go among several Jewish Christians and to tell them about the proclamations and the declarations that the Council of Jerusalem had come to, but then they could see and know that he is an uncircumcised man and dismiss him out of court. Sometimes our reservations in going the whole way can in fact hinder our mission. And so sometimes maybe God says, don't go yet because you are not ready to cross the line that is required in the mission that you are to undergo. You can't do it yet. Don't go into Asia, go to Macedonia instead. Now, it's just a nice coincidence that the Spirit, as recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, says don't go into Asia. I'm pretty sure he was not speaking about Japan, but I think the rule still applies. You're not ready for what's out over there. You haven't quite thought it through. Father Rodrigues doesn't know that yet. Eventually, Father Rodrigues is brought before a council of sorts. Several of the governors are placed before him, and Father Rodrigues can immediately tell that this council is reminiscent of many things in Christian history, not the least of which, of course, is the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, but also to a certain degree the Christians in the Colosseum, because he has an audience. Not only is there the council in front of him, but there's his flock of Christians over in a jail cell just over to his side over there. And knowing he has an audience, knows that this is the time for him to be tested. And in addition to that, this is his time to shine. And so brought forward before this council, he also has the translator from earlier sitting to his side. And the translator's job, as was told in the beginning, is to make sure that his testimony is accurately recited and retold to the council, but also so that the concerns of the council are brought back to him. Now, the first member of the council to speak immediately apologizes for the discomfort that Father Rodrigues would be feeling. And he starts by saying it in Portuguese. This reveals many things on many dimensions. One, because of the existence of the translator and this connection between the council member and Father Rodrigues, is that they do not want to lie, and they want to make this as honest and as fair as possible. You're not dealing with a cruel and capricious government, even though they are torturing people. They have this understanding that they are fulfilling the safety or the well-being of their people, however misguided as you may want to see it. And the fact that they have to use extreme measures for the protection of their people is an unpleasant feeling for them. Father Rodrigues can do only an appreciation of this. The council then continues by stating to him that they have thought over and reflected on the Christian teaching for some time, which one can understand that they would have, and that they have found that the teaching has no use in Japan. The response of Father Rodrigues is almost textbook for any evangelist. He says, yes, but I believe that we've brought you the truth, and the truth is applicable in all places, Japan, Portugal, or wherever. Funny enough, the old man from earlier is seated with this council, and he seems to like what Father Rodrigues is saying. Now, when the council then responds by saying, yeah, it may be true, sure, whatever, but have you ever noticed that certain seeds don't take root in certain lands? And of course, Father Rodrigues' response is to say, yes, but it is not the fault of the seed that the faith has not taken root here. It's been that the seeds and the saplings have been pulled up. The obvious statement being is that it's not because of the weakness on the part of Christianity, it's your hostility that has made this so. The old man again seems to agree. This confuses and befuddles Father Rodrigues a little bit. And the interrogation then continues with this line from the council. The reason we have outlawed Christianity in Japan is that after deep and earnest consideration, we find its teaching of no value for the Japan of today. Now this sounds strangely familiar for our modern context. So it's almost as if the trial that happened several hundred years ago is happening still. So what seems to have been missing? The priest, being completely aware that he has an audience, wants to ramp it up a little bit. Why did you begin this process of persuasion? The priest, lowering his eyes, spoke quietly. No matter what I say, you will not change your minds. And I also have no intention of altering my way of thinking. Even as he spoke, he felt a sudden onrush of emotion. The more conscious he became of being watched by the Christians from behind, the more he went on thinking of himself as a hero. No matter what I say, I will be punished. he exclaimed. The interpreter translated the words mechanically to the others. The rays of the sun made that flat face seem even more flat. Now, for the first time, the old man's hands stopped moving, and as shaking his head, he looked at the priest as though he were soothing a naughty child. "We will not punish the fathers without reason," he said. Father Rodrigues responds, "That's not the idea of Inoue. If you were Inoue, you would punish me instantly." At these words, the officials laughed heartily as though they had been told a joke. "What are you laughing at?" The priest responds, "Father, this is Inoue, the governor of Chikugo. He is here in front of you." The old man who had been following Rodrigues since Tomogi, and then in the wilderness, and now here, is that feared inquisitor whose name reached all the way to Macau and India. This Inoue, who used to be a Christian, was able to cause so many to lose their faith, was simultaneously a sympathetic audience in the council. So there's something going on in that old man that he has not yet seen. And there were two things that are of primary importance. It's that Inoue is not a merely vain man. A vain person wants recognition, acclaim, applause. If there's a vain man in this conversation, it is not Inoue, it's Rodrigues. He's aware of his audience and plays his hands plainly. Inoue hides. He not only hides from the Christians, hides the anger and resentment that he has towards them, but he also hides his power from Rodrigues, because his power lies elsewhere. And just as the translator diagnosed better in the movie, but also in the books, that this kid, this Father Rodrigues, is missing something. Now at first, Father Rodrigues is the one in spectacle in front of his Christians. But eventually the tables will turn. But before that, Kichijiro returns. Kichijiro demands to be arrested because he himself is a Christian and is put in the cell with the other Christians and Father Rodrigues. But when he's incarcerated, there becomes a divide. The Christians and Father Rodrigues and Kichijiro. And the two shall not meet. Because the fact is that Kichijiro has already revealed himself to be one who's willing to not only apostatize, but to turn in a priest. And he might have done so before with the villagers of Tomogi and Goto. He might have been the one that informed on them, but that's not entirely certain. But that doubt is precisely the problem. Who is this man? And yet, Kichijiro insists on receiving reconciliation from Father Rodrigues. Now, Father Rodrigues, like any other priest, if there is contrition, must hear the confession. And so he does. And in earshot of everybody. So Kichijiro is not only confessing to Father Rodrigues in secret, which is the usual form, he has to do it in front of this whole community. His being humiliated on a regular basis allows him, in a sense, to be more transparent than anybody. And he's so transparent about something that most of us would never dare admit. "I'm weak," he says. Something he repeats repeatedly. When he was in the wilderness with Father Rodrigues before, he admits, "I'm not like Ichizo and Mokichi. I am a weak man." In the confession inside the jail, he says, If I were to be persecuted a generation ago, I would have died a happy Christian. But now, in a time of persecution, my weakness makes me the way I am. Is that my fault? Father Rodrigues is not only disgusted by the man's character, but he's also disgusted by the smell. He gives him absolution. Quickly says, "Go in peace," and goes back with the other group. Kichijiro, the one who can publicly say, "Have mercy on me, a sinner," and the other ones who are keeping themselves safe from whatever it is that he might be up to. After having received reconciliation, Kichijiro is still not reconciled to the Japanese church or to Father Rodrigues, but to God for a time. Because afterwards, some of the Japanese Christians are then strewn out in a different council, and they are told to "Fr. And this time, their audience is Father Rodrigues. And as they're being compelled to trample, they're told it is only a formality. Which, of course, if it were only a formality, why are they doing it? But it's only a formality. It doesn't have to be a reflection of your innermost faith, but this is what you must do to be a loyal person. None of them do it. And in fact, when they are being summoned to do it, they're constantly looking over at Father Rodrigues. Any person who's had an authority role knows what that look is like. And this is one of the reasons I believe that the confessional is beautifully designed, so that the person doesn't need to look at the face of the priest so that they can mimic what they think the priest wants to see, that they can actually say it, that they don't have an audience. But truth be told, there is an audience. But this audience is conditioning their response. After all of them refuse to apostatize, one of them is decapitated. Blood flows, and they are told, "This is what happens." And then they bring out Kichijiro and tell him to "Fr." And again, in front of an audience. And again, Kichijiro apostatizes and runs away. This heartbreaking scene reveals a deep pain in each one of us. Do we show our fidelity in front of our family, friends, priests, bishops, so that they may think highly of us? What do we do when we have an audience? What do we do when we don't have an audience? When we're under family quarantine, do we keep up our prayer life? Do we develop a yearning and a longing for the Eucharist that no other can see? I can honestly say that in most of our parishes, most of the problems that we have, in my experience at least, maybe I'm just wrong, come from a desire to be seen as faithful, while not necessarily being faithful ourselves. It's that desire for appearances that can lead us to falter. Father Rodrigues then has one more interrogation with the inquisitor. And Inquisitor Inoue has this quiet calm about him. And he reveals to Father Rodrigues in a very nice room, in calm and peace, says, "I've been away in a town called Hirado. And eventually, there's something about that place that I'd like you to learn. There's a story about the governor there who had 4 concubines. I like how he says it in the movie. He has 4 concubines. 4. And the 4 concubines in the story are constantly fighting with each other, causing discord and dissension inside the household. And so the governor then expels all 4, and then peace reigns inside the house. The inquisitor asks Father Rodrigues, do you think that this story has a moral? Father Rodrigues says, oh yeah, he's a very wise man. Oh good, says the inquisitor. Very good. Then you probably then understand why we have to outlaw your religion. Oh. Because the town is Japan. The 4 concubines are Portugal, Spain, England, and Holland. And that the governor is Japan. And that to get peace in this house, these warring concubines have to get out. It's interesting because earlier in the book, it is also referenced that the Western powers, when they arrive in Japan, are bad-mouthing each other to the Japanese. And of course, as I'm sure you know, Spain and Portugal, Catholic, Holland and England, Protestant, don't like each other either. So they have divisions politically, they have divisions economically, they have divisions religiously. And so Inoue is basically saying, we don't want your divisions here. Get out. So Father Rodrigues' response is, well, we teach monogamy. So why don't you pick one wife? And so Inoue says, you mean Portugal? And Rodrigues says, no, the church. Inoue then says something of tremendous insight. As the interpreter unemotionally passed on this reply, Inoue's face fell, and raising his voice, he laughed. Considering his age, it was a high-pitched laugh, but there was no emotion in his eyes. He now turned on the priest. His eyes were not laughing. Father, don't you think it is better for this man called Japan to stop thinking about women from foreign countries, to be united with a woman born in the same country, a woman who has sympathy for his way of thinking? The priest knew well what Inoue meant by the foreign woman, but since the other was carrying on the argument in this apparently frivolous way, he felt he too must continue along the same lines. In the church, he said, nationality of the woman is not important. What matters is her fidelity to her husband. I see, says Inoue. And yet, if love of husband and wife were based only on emotion, no one would have to suffer from what we call the persistent love of an ugly woman. The magistrate nodded his head as though satisfied with his own way of speaking. There are some men in the world who get upset by the persistent affection of an ugly woman. You look upon missionary work as the forcing of love upon someone? Yes, that is what it is from our standpoint. And if you don't like the expression, let's put it this way. We call a woman who cannot bear children barren, and we think that such a woman has no capacity to be a wife. Rodrigues responds, if our doctrine makes no progress here in Japan, this is not the fault of the church. It is the fault of those who tear the Japanese Christians from the church like a husband from his wife. The interpreter, searching for words, was momentarily silent. This was the time the evening prayer ought to come floating from the Christian's prison, but today there was no sound. Suddenly the priest thought of the death sentence of 5 days before, a stillness that seemed to resemble this moment, but in reality so different. It was the time when the body of the one-eyed man lay prostrate on the ground in the flashing sun, and the guard unemotionally seizing one leg and dragging it off to the hole in the ground. leaving a trail of blood, just like a great line that had been traced over the earth with a brush. Was it possible, reflected the priest, that the order of this execution had been given by this benevolent old man who sat before him? Father, said the Lord of Chikugo, you and the other missionaries do not seem to know Japan. And you, honorable magistrate, answered the priest, you do not seem to know Christianity. At this they both laughed. And yet, said Inoue, 30 years ago, when I was a retainer in Gamo, I asked for the guidance of the fathers. And then? My reasons for opposing Christianity are different from those of the people at large. I have never thought of Christianity as an evil religion. The interpreter listened to those words with astonishment on his face, and while he stammered and searched for words, the old man kept looking at the bowl in his hands with his little remaining hot water, all the time laughing. Father, I want you to think over this old man has told you. One is the persistent affection of an ugly woman is an intolerable burden for a man, and the other that a barren woman should not become a wife. I said what Inoue said was wise, and it was a long reading. But he didn't say, the wisdom was, I don't see it as an evil religion. My reason for opposing it is different. And he doesn't say. It means that he has discerned a problem. He's discerned a problem in how the Christians have been preaching. A problem that is exemplified in Fr Rodrigues himself. In the next class, and in the next video, we will explore this problem. And the problem is precisely in the story of the concubines and the wife. Christians often treat their religion as natural to them and their family, their culture and their nation. We have this polite fantasy in the Christian world that we have ever lived in a Christian world. We've forgotten that in every way, the gospel that we preach has always been hard to receive. The soil has always resisted the truth. Now, Fr Rodrigues thought that his word itself brought the word. But he was mistaken. Inoue has realized that there is a tremendous gap between how things appear and how things are. The translator also pointed this out in his original conversation with Fr Rodrigues. Why would your God allow so much suffering and not alleviate it? And Fr Rodrigues' almost naive response is to say, if anyone follows God's command, he will live a blessed life. And the interpreter goes, oh, really? And I can also tell you that I wrote the exact same thing. Oh, no, I just said no in large letters. If it is true that God is really loving and merciful, how do you explain the fact that he gives so many trials and sufferings of all kinds to a man on his way to heaven? Sufferings of every kind? I think you're missing the point. If only man faithfully observes the commandments of our Deus, he should be able to live in peace. Not necessarily. The love that we've been given in Jesus Christ demands a cost. and a cost that sometimes bankrupts our nature. That is why we only go when we are sent. We ourselves have to be formed in such a way so that when we spend ourselves completely, we do not do what God prevented Abraham from doing, which is destroying the very promise. When God withheld from Abraham the sacrifice, he said, I suspect you're not ready to pay that price. That price is too high. Timothy will pay with some skin. But to love truly means to give one's life. And that's a price we can't pay until God decrees it. And God must pay it first. Rodrigues thought too glibly about life. Now, interestingly, this is something that we as Christians have encountered before. Inoue and the Council accuses Christianity of being too glib about life and its sufferings. And very often we as Christians do that. And in fact, one of the earliest criticisms of Christianity in the Roman world, recorded by Marcus Aurelius, is the exact same problem. This is Marcus Aurelius talking about life and death. What a noble thing is the soul ready for its release from the body, if now must be the time, and prepared for whatever follows, extinction, dispersal, or survival. But this readiness must come from a specific decision, not in mere revolt, like the Christians, but thoughtful, dignified, and if others are to believe it, undramatic. This view that Christians treat life lightly I'm sad to say, is probably accurate. In the book of Revelation, it describes the saints in a peculiar way, where it says, love for life did not deter them from death. But very often we can shortcut it. We can love life in a cowardly way and become like Kichijiro, or we can have a proud disdain of death and think ourselves to be beyond struggles and travails that we are not yet beyond. The saying is sure, strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. And Jesus says to his disciples, you can't go with me now. Where I am going, you cannot follow. But after I have risen from the dead, then you will follow me. Now, Peter did say, I will follow you wherever. Will you follow me? Till the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. Father Rodrigues will try to be faithful because his pride depends on it. Kichijiro did sin in renouncing his Lord. But he did do one thing that Father Rodrigues could not do. Admit that he's a frail and broken man. That takes moral courage. Not just about admitting the things that you should do for the Lord, but knowing the things that you can't. I'll conclude with a little story about when I was acting as a missionary in Mexico. We would go to a very minor prison in Tijuana called La Vente, which was just a day or 2 prison. It's basically where they would just arrest people on the streets, homeless people, prostitutes, etc. And because you could just be arrested, many people were just there. Sad thing was, of course, is that they weren't fed very well. So our ministry was to bring sandwiches there. And the prison establishment was very gracious in letting us come in and to do this ministry. So we would bring out sandwiches to everybody who was there. And they had different wings. So the male wing was huge, and it was the whole top floor. And then on the bottom were vulnerable men. Male prostitutes would be kept in a very specific wing to be protected from the other prisoners. Bring sandwiches to them, sandwiches to everybody else. The other section of the prison that was cordoned off was that which was specifically for women. And almost all of them were prostitutes. And almost all of them, because of a lifetime of abuse and who knows what, had learned how to manipulate the malice inside a man's heart. And I went to bring in the sandwiches in there one day. And I walked inside, started handing out sandwiches. And when I was upstairs with the men, when a guy would try to convince me to give him an extra sandwich, saying no is pretty simple. But it was down with the women when I received all sorts of offers for an extra sandwich. It was then that I learned that there are some ministries that you are not prepared for yet. To be able to look at a person without coveting what they have, without using them as a prop for your own self-glory, without using your apologetics to reveal that you're philosophically or theologically smarter than your enemies, of realizing that the Son of Man came to serve and not to be served, that Jesus does not score points with his Father by loving us. The only points that he gets is the joy of showing us mercy. Now, Fr Rodrigues is not a bad man, but he's using the sufferings of these Christians as a means of building himself up. And sadly, those who exalt themselves will be humbled. And in the case of Kichijiro, those who humble themselves will be exalted. May God bless you, and I'll see you next time.